When it comes to venerating images, which would be bowing before an icon, kissing an icon, praying in front of an icon, or praying to the saint that's depicted in it, then people who aren't a part of traditions that do that will look at that and say, "Oh, this is idolatry. You should be praying only to God. Images shouldn't have anything to do with it." And if we're going to make that claim, then we need to figure out what is idolatry. If you're accusing someone of idolatry, then it'd be nice to actually know what idolatry is. And then along with this discussion, there's this idea. You will hear people say, "We venerate the saint. We don't worship the saint. We worship God alone." And it's almost like one thing that we're going to say is that this what people call icon veneration. This will be an unexpected way to phrase this. What people call icon veneration is worship and is not idolatry. I don't know if you appreciate that.
No, I think that's very accurate.
Okay.
Because one thing I was going to say is, you'll hear this from some people say that, well, we venerate the icon, but we don't worship it. And I think they're attempting to use language from, like, for example, John of Damascus. The only problem is the word that John of Damascus is using there, the two words that he's using, as like in the King James Bible, both of those words are translated as worship. So
Yeah.
he'd be using proskinesis and latria.
Okay, so we've got these two Greek words which mean different things, and in an English Bible, we're going to get one word, which is the word worship, and neither one of those words actually means worship.
Yeah, so like I would go beyond that and say, so you have 4 written down here. There are actually 5 Greek words in the New Testament that would be translated as worship, and 6 Hebrew words in the Old Testament. So like there's these very different terms in the biblical languages that in English all just kind of get mashed together into one word. So that means when you have commandments about, you should only worship the Lord your God and worship no other gods, or don't, you have the second commandment, don't make any graven image, and don't worship any image or bow down to any image. These things get confused because we're not reading things the same as how they are written in the original languages. Like I said, since we translate all of these things with the same 1 or 2 words, some very different contexts, some very different concepts all get mashed together.
Okay, and this is weird. Even if those words meant what the English word worship means, mm-hmm. which they don't, then it would still be kind of a tricky situation to say worship God alone, because what worship means is to ascribe worth to something, to ascribe value to something.
Right.
And it doesn't seem that the only thing that you would ascribe value to would be God.
Yeah.
It seems like there are other things that are also valuable, but that are lesser than God, that are beneath Him in some way, but they still have value. And so even just that word that we use, which is the word worship, to say worship God alone, it's when we say that, then it is very unclear what we actually mean when we say worship.
Yeah. So I guess like when looking at the biblical language, I'm probably more familiar with Greek and you're probably more familiar with Hebrew, so I don't know if it'd be okay to let you deal with the Hebrew and they would deal with the Greek. Are you?
Yeah, that's fine.
So like what I know from the New Testament Greek and also the Old Testament Septuagint Greek, the New Testament will very closely parallel the Greek Old Testament in terms of these things and lots of other things. So the most common word that you'll have that's translated as worship is proskuneo, or proskuneo, which like literally would mean to bow down. So proskuneo is not going to be used only in reference to God. So proskuneo will also be used like in reference to, say, those in government authority over you. Like you pay them reverence, you might say.
Yeah, but interestingly, and this is, again, I don't want to harp too much on our translation issues, but in the Bible, when that word is referring to God, then we will translate it as worship, and when it's referring to something other than God, then we will use the word bow,
Yeah.
or maybe prostrate.
Right. Or reverence.
And
like reverence those in
yeah,
authority.
yeah, right.
It's literally saying prostrate yourselves before them.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, that's the etymological meaning of the word anyways.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it can be a sort of metaphorical. It could be that reverence is a better translation than bow before.
Right.
I'm not going to make that judgment. It may not be, but it could be that that's a better translation.
Yeah, I would say it's likely.
But it's still kind of curious that you would use one word for God and one word for not God when the Bible uses one word in both situations.
Yeah. Right. So the other major word, well, not the other major word, but another major word that is not only used as worship directed to God, but is often translated as worship in the New Testament is sevome. I don't think it's used very many times, if I remember right. It only appears a few times, like maybe it's like 10 times or something like that in the New Testament.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you the numbers, but it's way less common. Yeah.
And then you don't have this on your list. The other one you have on your list, I'm not actually familiar with how often or how much and in what context it's used. I don't think it's as common. But so you also have the word doxa, which is like doxology or orthodox. It's sometimes translated as worship. More often it will be translated as praise or glory.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a couple times in the King James, for example, that it's translated as worship.
Yeah.
And then the other big one is Latria, which, again, if you're going back to John of Damascus and he's saying you only worship God and you don't, and you venerate images or you venerate saints, what he's saying is you only offer latria to God and proskuneo to images or saints. So what latria means specifically is more of a ritualized worship, pretty much involving some kind of offering or sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
So it's also translated, like in addition to being translated as worship in the New Testament, it's also translated as serve, like especially with the idea of serving the altar. The idea of service there being connected to like performing the ritual acts that you do on an altar. And this word is only going to be used in reference to God, or I'm thinking there are a couple times in the New Testament where it's used to refer to like pagans worshiping their gods.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea being like this kind of service, the offering of some kind of sacrifice or incense or something like that, is something that is done to God alone, or in idolatrous worship to a demon.
Yeah.
So I would argue that the sense of idolatry only enters in the biblical text with this idea of latria, and not with any of the other things that you do.
So just to interject here, to maybe simplify this a little bit, with these definitions, an understanding of the different words used, could it be fair to say then that we revere a lot of things, or we revere things, but with an understanding of the hierarchy of things?
I think like you have the idea in the Bible that you do, but what I would say is that American culture is an especially irreverent culture.
Right.
And I think that contributes a great deal to our confusion. So like we would not honor and revere the president, for example, even though 100 years ago you would have. And like we also like elevate it to a value that like, oh, well, he's just a man, so why should we honor and revere him? It's like, well, in the past you would have said, well, he's a person in authority, and all authority is derived from God, and so you honor and revere those in authority as unto God. It's like, well, Paul actually says that. That's not a pagan concept.
Yeah, right.
So, but then you would not, like, you wouldn't give the president, what was the last word that you mentioned?
You wouldn't serve the sacrifice.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
wouldn't serve the sacrifice to the president, but
Yes.
you would also give him the reverence he's due because of the order of.
Yeah, so like if you look at, let's say, for example, Pliny, can't remember which Pliny it is. I think it's Pliny the Younger, is talking about how he roots out the Christians in the territory that he's the governor of. And what it is like, well, he rounds up all these people that are accused of being Christians, and he forces them to offer sacrifices to the pagan gods and to the emperor. The emperor at the time was Trajan. So he forces them to offer sacrifices to these images, because the real Christians won't do this. But the ones who aren't Christians will gladly do it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, this is how you find out who's Christian and who's not. So like the Christians will pay reverence and respect and honor to the image of the emperor. Like you have that very clearly represented in pagan texts concerning Christians.
Yeah.
And also Christian texts about Christians. Like they'll very clearly do all of these things. And Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is due to him. Paul says, give the honor and respect and reverence to the authority that is due to them. But the line that they will not cross is offering a sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
So like, no, this is for God alone. We will not, reverence, just so that it's clear, reverence in the ancient world would include bowing down and kissing images. So like, it appears that Christians would have been willing to offer that sort of reverence to those to whom it was due, but they would not be willing. Like, I might be mistaken on that, so you can correct me if you find documents that say, no, we will not reverence the emperor in that way. But I think they would have, it's my understanding. But they would not be willing to offer sacrifices to their image.
Yeah, I think you would have people who are unwilling to bow before the emperor, but I would also say where you have that, it's like Christians that are pressured to bow under the emperor, and that would signify that they hold the emperor to be a god on earth.
Yeah, that would be accurate.
In that instance, if it's something like that, then they would refuse.
Yeah.
But again, like you have people in the Bible that are bowing to kings and bowing to people that are in authority, and they're bowing with this same proskuneo word that we're using when we bow to God.
Yeah, right. And this is all very confusing to a modern person, because there's not a culture in the West, as far as I'm aware, that would have anything like a custom of bowing down to the king or to the prime minister or the president, or kissing his ring, or kissing an image that somebody brings to you of him as his representative. Like not any of these things, but those things would have been universally done in the ancient world.
Yeah.
So that makes these practices very confusing to a modern person. And I would phrase that as, like, I would tend to look at that as, in the eyes of a first century Christian, modern American culture is just extremely irreverent. We don't revere or respect anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess you can judge for yourself whether that's good or bad.